button. Okay, so there seems to be a lot of concern, as there always is, about these issues, free speech, civility, and then cancel culture is a somewhat new concept. But just to start off by maybe distinguishing those concepts. So free speech is usually discussed in the context of um, authority, such as the government. So the ability to be able to speak, write, publish opinions on serious matters, on politics, religion, morals, philosophy, things like that, without suffering any kind of legal consequence, without being jailed, without being censored, that sort of thing. Um, Again, be sure and mute yourself if you haven't already done so. Civility is quite a different issue. That's more about, are people able to engage in serious discussion politely? So you can disagree with people without it becoming nasty, without it becoming personal. So there's a concern that things are going in the wrong direction with regard to that. The internet is something that maybe exacerbates that problem. If you ever go on YouTube and read the comments under a YouTube video, you'll find if it's on any kind of serious issue, before long somebody gets called a Nazi and compared to Hitler, that sort of thing. So that's the concern. That's kind of a quick way to get into the concern about civility. Now, the term cancel culture is pretty new, as I understand it. So somebody's not muted. So if you could mute yourself, I'd appreciate that. So cancel culture, as I understand it, is a rather new term. And so the idea of someone being canceled in the context of free speech issues, someone has uttered an opinion that people disagree with, that people find offensive, people are outraged by, and then there are calls for them to be fired, or let's say it's an actor, let's not go to their movies anymore, that sort of thing, for someone to be kind of wiped away because they have let it be known they have opinions that people find offensive. And so this is the idea of someone being canceled. And so some claim that we've become a kind of cancel culture. So, if someone says things that a lot of people find offensive, rather than there being a robust debate about it, there are these sort of immediate, very personal consequences. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is to say that these issues of free speech have been a big concern for philosophers for centuries. That's my field, philosophy. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about philosophy, except just in this section, I want to say something about the history of this from the standpoint of philosophers. So one of the first major philosophers in Western culture was Socrates. Pretty much everybody's heard of Socrates. And he was executed in the year 399 BC, essentially because of his philosophical views. He was put on trial. The two charges were corrupting the youth of Athens, and that would be with his philosophical questioning and teaching. And the other charge was not believing in the official state gods of Athens. And so he was executed. So then another way of getting into this, the Roman Catholic Church, for quite a long time, for several centuries, had an official index of banned writers and banned books that Roman Catholics were forbidden to read on pain of excommunication. That was started in 1559, and it was only discontinued in 1966. And when you look at the list of authors on there, it's practically the syllabus for a course in modern philosophy. So just to run through the list, all of these authors were ones that were on this official list of books that people weren't supposed to read. Giordano Bruno And by the way, he was burned at the stake in the year 1600 for his views. So it went beyond just censorship. So Giordano Bruno, then others on the list: Hobbes, Pascal, Descartes, Francis Bacon, Montaigne, Spinoza, Malebranche, Maimonides, Locke, Berkeley, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot, Hume, Rousseau, Kant, Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Henri Bergson, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, all of those banned. We had a lecture here at Purdue Northwest a couple of years ago by a scholar from the University of Chicago, who said something that I hadn't realized, that it was possible to get a kind of special dispensation. There were offices you could go to within the Roman Catholic Church to get special permission to read books that were on the list. Like if you had a special research project or something, they might give you special permission. And this scholar said it was kind of amusing because it would often be, okay, we'll let you have some pornography, but you can't read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So at any rate, so this has been a special problem for philosophers. Just to give two modern examples, Bertrand Russell, he was jailed in 1918 for giving speeches against Britain getting into World War I. And then when he was given a position at the City College of New York to teach courses in logic, there was a lawsuit, and in the lawsuit, he was found to be morally unfit to teach. So he was stripped of the position. And the reason he was found morally unfit is that he had written a book in 1929 called Marriage and Morals, where he argued that premarital sex was not immoral. And so in 1940, that was grounds that you can't have someone like that teaching logic, even though he was perhaps the foremost logician in the world. All right, so the next thing I'd like to do is I'm going to try, and I'm very technologically unsavvy, but I'm going to try to share my screen and show you this letter that was published in Harper's that has triggered a lot of discussion of this sort of thing. So push the share screen button and then go to this and share. Okay, so let me ask, Mary Beth, can you see it now? Is this visible, the Harper's letter?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So this is a letter that was published in Harper's magazine, and you can see pretty recently in July 2020, and it's gotten a tremendous amount of attention. And so I want to go through this a little bit to sort of further frame our discussion, and I'll be very interested in your thoughts about this. I'm not going to read the whole thing out loud, but let me just sort of summarize it as we go through. So it talks about what's going on right now in the world. There are protests for racial and social justice. There are demands for police reform, things of that nature. And so the signatories to this letter are saying, okay, again, we need to have muting. I'm hearing people talking. Please mute yourself if you're not muted. So the signatories to this letter are saying, you know, this is a good thing that there are these developments going on, but they worry that, on the other hand, a negative aspect of it is there's a new sort of censoriousness that's come into it, that anyone who's not fully on board with these demands for change, then they're going to be canceled. There'll be calls to fire them and so forth. And so then a lot of what follows is kind of right out of John Stuart Mill's book on liberty. It just talks a whole lot about the importance of the free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society. You know, we have to be able to have a free discussion. One of the things that has caused this letter to be criticized is it is rather vague. It's lacking in specifics. So here in this second paragraph, you'll notice it gives lots of examples, but it doesn't tell you like who the people are. So people kind of wonder if it's being analyzed correctly. So I'll say things like editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Well, which editors and which pieces we might like to know sort of the full merits of it. But at any rate, it gives these sort of general examples without giving the specific information. And then on the second page, it talks about, again, more of sort of the need for there to be this kind of free speech, how it needs to be possible for people to make mistakes, to make errors without their lives being ruined. The last paragraph, the way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by these kinds of heavy-handed tactics that have been used. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. All right, so the letter has gotten a fair amount of criticism, and so I want to talk about that next. So one criticism has been directed at the idea that there is an increase in these kinds of attacks on free speech. And so I'm going to just read you, it's pretty short, one statement of this. This is from a philosopher named Justin Weinberg, where he writes, "Why do people think that society is growing increasingly intolerant? One possible answer has to do with trends towards social egalitarianism. While historically many people in society have had to watch what they say, members of racial minorities, women, atheists, gays, communists, etc., lest they offend those with more power over them. Now, even those who are members of traditionally privileged and powerful demographics have to too. And since so much of our cultural understanding of society is dominated by voices and images of the privileged, we hear about and notice the imposition and operation of these speech norms more when they are applied to them. We tend not to hear so much about the cancellation of the voiceless." So, so a couple of things are going on here. So one is that because of social media, it's much more possible for people who don't have an official platform to get their views out there and thus call attention to maybe offensive or questionable things that are being said by people who are more powerful. So there's more of kind of more opportunity for the powerless to criticize the powerful. You might put it that way. So that's one aspect of it. In response to that, I would suggest, I mean, that's an interesting question as to whether the issue has gotten more intense in recent years or not. But to me, the important issue is just how we should respond to it rather than worrying about whether it's getting better or worse. We want to get it where it should be. That's sort of the important issue. So a second criticism is that maybe in the letter there's something of a conflation of constraint and criticism. In other words, some people seem to think there's a big free speech problem because their ideas get harshly criticized. So as one critic put it, the entire debate frequently comes down to some claim like the following. I want to hold what many believe to be morally repugnant positions and be well liked at the same time. But in fairness to the letter does address that and say, I'm seeing if I can find it here. It says in here somewhere, bear with me, let me see if I can find it right away. Second paragraph. Here it is. Sorry, it took me a minute to find it. We uphold the value of robust and even caustic counterspeech from all quarters. So the letter does say, yeah, that's not what we're talking about. We're not saying there's a problem if when you issue your thoughts, you get harshly criticized. That's okay. They're more concerned about when there are moves to censor speech, to get people fired for their speech that people find objectionable, that sort of thing. And then a third criticism is to say, well, look, the issue has a bit more nuance than the letter lets on, because there is a legitimate issue about platforming. So here we get into the distinction between free speech on the one hand, and I guess the issue of cancel culture on the other. So it's one thing to talk about, we don't want there to be government censorship of ideas. We don't want authorities attaching criminal penalties to the free exchange of ideas. But it's another thing to talk about who should be given a platform, who should get a chance to write editorials in the New York Times, who should get to appear on the Sunday morning talk shows on television to talk about politics. That's a kind of scarce and precious resource. Most people aren't given that platform. And so some have argued, well, that's kind of a legitimate issue. If you've got people who are based on the content of their speech, showing themselves to be less qualified than others to make a meaningful contribution, that's a legitimate issue to raise. So those are some of the questions that have been brought forth. All right, so what I want to say about this is that what I want to do is suggest that maybe one thing that is needed is a kind of reform in the culture about the ethics of public debate, public communication. And so I have in mind something like the following. Let's take this concern about civility. And again, if we go to the last part of the letter, where it talks about we need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. So I'm struck by that phrase, good faith disagreement. And so here's what I want to suggest. In order for public debate to be helpful, it's important for people to be able to give reasons in support of what they are saying, for them to be able to cite evidence, to be able to give arguments. And even more important in a way, a responsiveness to questions, to objections, to counter arguments. Now you're really contributing to a debate. You're laying out an idea, and then if somebody comes in and says, well, look, here's where I think you've gone wrong, and they give a counter argument, that you're willing to address that in a serious way. Or if someone has a question, you're willing to engage with it and try to answer. And my sense, and I'm curious if other people, if you agree with me on this, or if you think I'm wrong about this, my sense is that's something that is sorely lacking in our culture. There's not the sense that if you're going to participate in public debate, you have to be scrupulous about evidence, you have to be scrupulous about argument, you have to have an openness to respond to criticism, and openness to answer objections and counter arguments. And so consider, for example, it seems to me whenever I am watching politicians, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or whatever, I don't think that even matters to this. I find it all over the place. If there's a question that if it were to be answered, it would expose a flaw in their thinking, they'll just duck it. They'll just they'll pivot, as they say, and just go to their talking points. And that's not considered an affront to civility. And so I think it ought to be. So this is a kind of moral reform that I'm advocating. Um, the idea here would be, this is a way we can avoid physically fighting each other and shooting each other and punching each other in the face, is that people have enough respect that if you have a question for them when they've entered the arena of public debate, they're willing to answer it, and they're willing to take seriously objections. And so, in other words, there's this demand for civility, but there's not there's not seen to be a corresponding obligation to deal fairly with people who disagree with you. There's sort of this idea I can sort of spout my opinions, and then people have to just respect it and back off. And then this also ties in with the issue of being able to make decisions over people's lives. So this becomes especially egregious when it's people who are in positions of power who make decisions over our lives. And then when we ask for a justification and offer criticism, then they duck and pivot and all of that kind of stuff. So uh, so this has to do with civility, and I think this same point applies to platforming. So what I'm looking for, I think what people are worried about with the cancel culture business is that there are political criteria for keeping people out of public forums. And that is a worry. We want a robust political debate with all stripes of political opinion being permitted. So, but at the same time, we want some criteria for platforming, because again, that's a scarce resource. We don't just have everybody on the Sunday morning talk shows and writing editorials in the New York Times and so on. And so are there non-political criteria for that? And so I'm suggesting this also, what I've been saying before about this ethics of debate applies to that as well. If someone ducks and pivots and is evasive when they're asked perfectly legitimate questions that are responsive to what they're saying, they're not participants in public debate. Let's get them off the platform and get someone else in there. So that's the kind of canceling I would advocate. Let's cancel people who do that, people who duck and pivot. Um, so those two things go together in that way. So these would be epistemic criteria, if you will, rather than straightforwardly political criteria. And so then one other sort of epistemic, and if you're not familiar with that word, epistemic, having to do with knowledge, having to do with the quest for knowledge and truth. And so I've given you an ethical one about this responsiveness to counter argument, to question, and so forth. And then another one that I think is reasonably non-political would be track record. So here's a kind of innocuous example of what I have in mind. Many years ago, during one of the presidential races, I saw an interview with a journalist, and he was very candid, and I appreciated his candidness in telling this story. He talked about how he, for the first time ever, had been invited onto one of those television talk shows and asked to give his opinion about who was going to win the Iowa caucus. And without going into a lot of details, this was, I think, on the Democratic side, and the latest polls had shown that three candidates were about tied going into the caucus. And so he had very confidently predicted who would win. And he gave a whole theory as to why. I'm really quite confident, this is the candidate who's going to win, and here's why. I know the polls show they're neck and neck, but look, that's overlooking this factor. You factor this in, this is the guy who's going to win. So the person he very confidently predicted would win lost very, very badly and was well far behind. And so then this journalist says he was quite shocked when they invited him back on the show the next week to predict who was going to win in the next primary. And his idea was, well, I've kind of demonstrated that I'm not competent at this, that I don't really know what I'm doing. but they didn't care. You know, they just liked the entertainment value of someone who I guess had the right kind of look on television and was able to make a prediction confidently and so on. So, you know, in science, we have this idea that when you have a theory, then you test it, and you test it by making predictions. You know, if my hypothesis, I should say hypothesis rather than theory, if my hypothesis is true, what would be the implications, you know, in this real world situation or in this experimental situation? And then we see what happens, and either it's consistent with, you know, what my hypothesis would say, or if it's not. To the extent that it's not, that's disconfirming evidence. As far as I know, that plays no role in platforming in our culture now. It's never the case, as far as I know, that someone loses their platform because they make wrong predictions constantly. Nor is it the case that somebody who gets it right consistently, that gets noticed and they get more of a platform. So maybe I'll just make one more point, and then I'll try to wrap it up and let other people get in and talk about all this stuff. So what I've tried to do in this talk is indicate that while there perhaps is a problem of people being deplatformed for the wrong reason, they're being deplatformed because they have said things that people disagree with, and then rather than there being a vigorous discussion, it's like we're just going to censor that viewpoint. Um, so I'm saying, yeah, that's a legitimate point, but the issue of platforming, it's not as if everybody has a platform, and we should be somewhat selective given the scarcity of platforms. And so I've tried to suggest some non-political criteria that could be used for this. So to just briefly sum up, I think I've suggested two. One was an ethical one that still has an epistemic basis, epistemic meaning aiming toward truth, aiming toward knowledge. And this was a willingness to engage questions, objections, counter arguments, not ducking them, not pivoting them, not just turning to your talking points, but taking seriously what the other person is saying. I think very few people who have a platform now meet that standard. And in our culture, that's not something that we tend to value. So just to further defend that point, politicians do that. Politicians and also pundits, they tend to do that because they don't pay a price for doing it. So I think that's a cultural change we need to try to foster, where you pay more of a price for doing that than you do for candidly answering in a way that one might disagree with. So that's the first of the two criteria. And the second one has to do with track record, where one is analyzing events and making predictions. We should try to hear more from people who have a record of getting these things right, and less from people who have a record of getting these things wrong. Let me give you an example on that last point. There used to be a program on CNN called Crossfire, where they would have, by the way, I suppose I can get this off the screen. Let me see if I can do that. Bear with me a second. No, that's not what I want. Let's see here. I guess I could stop share. Okay, Mary Beth, is that right? Am I okay?
You are white, and everything's back to the way it was, and you have a question in the chat if you're ready for one.
But let me just finish this point I was just now making, and then I'm ready to turn it completely over to questions. So thank you for telling me that. So just to this point I was just now making about wanting to platform people who get things right and deplatform people who constantly get things wrong. So I remember there used to be a show on CNN called Crossfire, where the premise was they'd have one journalist who supposedly is on the left and another one who is supposedly on the right, And then they would also get a guest sort of from each side, and then they would have this sort of crossfire. That was the deal. And so during the Iraq War, the guy who was nominally on the left brought up, well, you know, everything that the Bush administration said about how there would be weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, you know, they were all wrong. They didn't find any weapons of mass destruction. And so then the other guy said, well, you can't criticize him for that. Everybody we had on this show agreed with that. And I wanted to kick my TV at that point, because of course there were lots of people who said that the evidence was very poor that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. None of those people were given a platform, none of them. And all the people who said with great confidence that there were, it didn't cost any of them anything. So that's just fantastically unscientific. So that's an example of what I'm talking about there. All right, I think those are the main points I wanted to make. So I'm ready to open it up for questions and discussion. And Mary Beth has told me there is a question. How do I access the question? Should I just have the person unmute and speak up? Is that the way we should
We
do
could
it?
do that, or if you
Let's
can,
do that.
can you see the chat as well? It's there.
I probably can. Let me take a look
Okay.
here.
Okay. So it's from David Nalbone. So he's our first question.
Oh, yeah. So, well, first of all, here's what Dave said. How can this new norm be enforced? After all, voluntary self-regulation has not proved too successful. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I have no idea how it would be enforced. I'm looking for people's attitude on this to change, and I have no magic formula for making that happen. So it's just a question of, I suppose, advocating for it, and in particular, advocating for people to be sensitive to this, so that they will be more inclined to punish, in terms of voting and what have you, politicians who you know, duck and pivot more than they do now. But you know, I really don't. I think these things happen slowly, and they happen in a kind of grassroots kind of way. It's not that I have an enforcement mechanism for it or anything like that. Let's see. I see another question. Oh, from my friend Roy Schuster. Roy, I'm so glad you're here. Now let me scroll down and see. Suddenly now I can't. Roy, could I ask you to unmute and just speak up, because somehow your comment disappeared from my screen?
No problem, David. How are you?
I'm doing great, Roy.
Good, good. I wanted to get your view on something that happened a couple of years ago at the University of Chicago. One of the business professors invited Steve Bannon to to speak on campus, and there was a huge controversy over it, with, you know, sort of the community being divided between those who wanted to, you know, permit him to speak just based on, you know, open exchange of ideas, and others were against it on the basis that, you know, legitimizing his viewpoints, which many believe to be racist, xenophobic, etc., was not the purpose of a university, because, you know, inviting him to speak gave some legitimacy to his viewpoints. Wondering what you think about that. And, you know, you know, one of the points that was raised at the time I thought was interesting was, where do you draw the line? Because I heard someone from the university say, you know, when asked if they would allow David Duke to speak, they said, of course not. Well, where do you draw the line when it comes to, you know, hate speech and, you know, kind of on that spectrum?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So I guess what I would say about that is, well, first of all, Roy, let me ask you, who invited him? Was it like some club on campus that invited him?
It was a faculty member, an business professor.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think that that there shouldn't be a rule against someone like that being invited. I mean, I don't think, you know, he has anything worthwhile to contribute, but I think it's dangerous to try to set up a rule where you can't have someone like that come. also from a political standpoint, it's probably counterproductive. If you try to block someone like that from speaking, then it sort of becomes, aren't you a censor? Aren't you an authoritarian? Aren't you intolerant?
Mhm.
So just for that political reason also, I think it's better to try to, the old cliche about counter speech rather than trying to block his speech. So yeah, I wouldn't be happy about someone like that being given a platform, but I don't think I would be in favor of making that, of having a policy against it or trying to have him blocked or something like that. What do you think about it, Roy? What do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I was uncomfortable with it, of course, but it really, what really got to me though was this question of where the line is drawn, right?
Yeah,
Because and as I said, it was brought up. Would you invite someone from the Ku Klux Klan to speak? Of course not, but you'll invite someone who has somewhat overlapping views, who has legitimacy because he happened to be in the Trump administration, right? So
yeah,
that,
yeah.
that where that line is drawn would have to be debated, right? Of course,
Right. See,
right?
what part of what makes these issues so difficult
Hmm.
is that censorship is one thing, but then on the other hand, obviously decisions have to be made. I like, for example, all of us who teach, we have to make decisions about what materials to assign in our courses. We don't just assign everything, that's ever been written. Um, and so similar things apply here. You would hope that people would have good judgment about who is going to have something interesting and worthwhile to say that we can learn from, that will contribute to the debate, and who won't.
Right.
um, but again, I think once a bad decision along those lines has been made, I think it's probably does more harm than good to try to undo it in some formal way. I
Sure.
could be wrong. I'm not very good at politics, but that, for what it's worth, that's my sense of it.
Yeah, one last point. Outside of politics, the same kind of thing comes up. I think sometimes when it gets as it relates to scientific fact, right? So, do you have climate change deniers or people who are anti-vaccination, who have opinions that are contrary to scientific consensus? Do they have a legitimate right to speak in legitimate forums, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So that issue comes up quite a lot. Let me say two things about that. So, like, one area where I'm very familiar with that, I've actually taught courses on this, is the history of attempts to pass laws mandating the teaching of creationism, or what later came to be called intelligent design theory, in biology classes. And so this gets into this same sort of area where, on the one hand, people will say, well, come on, what are you afraid of? Why not have a kind of free and open debate? But on the other hand, those theories don't pass scientific muster. So if you want to use as a criterion of what you include in a science class theories that have some kind of scientific standing, then you're not going to include those. But then if you don't, people will say, oh, you're being a censor, and so on. So I don't think there's some magic solution to that. I mean, one needs judgment. But then I guess the other thing I was going to say, and I'm glad you brought up the climate denial, I like to dream about how the culture might change. I'm old enough now that I've seen it change in lots of areas. And I'd like to see it change to become a culture that is more concerned with a rigorous and evidence-based pursuit of truth. And maybe some of the things we're seeing in the world will contribute to that. So climate change would be a good example. We're seeing all of these horrible fires in California and all sorts of other things happening. And this is happening largely because of people being so irresponsible about the debate in terms of the science. And the coronavirus pandemic is another case in point. So maybe that's something the culture will sort of pick up on, that we've got to be more serious about actually following the evidence where it is, rather than I'm spiraling out of control. I'll just let it go at that.
We
Thanks for
have
the
a
question, Roy. It was a good one.
Thank you, David.
we have a question that maybe is a little bit in that ballpark, but from Orlando. So if blocking speech is not an option, how can misinformation be prevented effectively?
Yeah, well, of course, that's a great question too. And again, there's not any kind of magic theory for that. I mean, ideally, what was the phrase? Was it offensive speech or bad speech? I've forgotten what the phrase was.
Misinformation.
Misinformation, right. Yeah, in an ideal world, the presence of misinformation wouldn't be so bad because it could be effectively countered with good information. But that really only works if people have a certain kind of commitment to evidentiary rigor and a certain competence with it. And I remember reading a book that came out a long time ago in 1985. Maybe some of you have read it, by a communications professor, Neil Postman, called Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he argued we'd become an amusement, an entertainment-based culture. And so he argues that we kind of have lost sight of serious debate because we're all about entertainment and amusement. And so that's what debates are. They're just about entertainment and amusement. So I wish I had a good answer to that question. I don't think there's any way to prevent misinformation from being promulgated. And the best we can do is try to counter it as effectively as we can. But that's not foolproof by any means. And you probably have seen these polls, the amazing things that huge percentages of people believe that are just crazy stuff, not based on anything. So I wish I had an answer. I don't. It's an excellent question. Other thoughts? And by the way, not just questions. I'm happy to answer questions, but also if some of you just have thoughts you'd like to share, this is a forum for that as well. Sorry, go ahead, Mary Beth.
Our next comes from Jeff, and I think he's using Latin, but who is going to keep the keepers of the platform?
Well, look, you could get into an infinite regress if you want to say that. If you're going to say you need keepers of the platform and keepers of the keepers of the platform, then who are the keepers of the keepers of the keepers? I mean, yeah, sure. Whoever has responsibility for for platforming people or not, they should do it in a responsible way. And then to the extent that other people can influence that by, I don't know, writing letters or not watching their shows or not reading their papers, they can try to influence it. But I mean, that question just leads to an infinite regress, so I guess that's what I would say about that. Other thoughts? What do all of you think about? Let me ask all of you, if there's not an immediate question for me, do you think that there is an increasing problem in this area of free speech and civility and cancel culture? Is it your sense that that something is going on in this area? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Deepa. Deepa has hands up.
Yes, Deepa, please. I can't hear Deepa. I don't know if other people can.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Deepa.
Sorry, I forgot. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So David, I just wanted to say that I'm uncomfortable with the way the word freedom is used at all in modern Western civilization, because it doesn't come from any kind of inner freedom. It's just an external freedom, sort of put in place by a constitution. And there's very little distinction being made any longer between freedom and licentiousness. And those are two different things altogether. And so I think a line should be drawn between those two. When one person's freedom begins harming another person, that's no longer freedom. So I think the very notion of freedom is worth mulling over at this point in the history of the
Yeah, I mean, certainly we need to think about what freedom is. I don't know that I would go quite as far as to say that when your freedom harms someone else, it's no longer freedom. I think usually that's true. I guess we'd have to get into an analysis of what harm is. So, like, for example, some people are just sort of deeply wounded, it seems, if someone expresses an opinion that's very much contrary to some view they hold dear. So on some analysis, you could say they were harmed by that, but I think we should have the freedom to harm them in that way. Um, Although I agree with you in general, when you're harming other people, that's a problem and freedom shouldn't extend that far. But one other point I would make about the freedom issue in connection with free speech is I think a lot of people tend to conflate the issue of us having the freedom to think whatever we want or say whatever we want with that being worthy of respect, that should be considered a plausible view, something like that. And those are really two distinct ideas. I mean, the first idea is just you can think whatever you want and say whatever you want and not be thrown in jail for it, not to have your work censored for it, and so forth. Um, but, and this goes back to this ethic I was talking about before, there ought to be the idea that it's hard work to figure out what the truth is about a lot of subjects. It's hard work to figure out what is the most reasonable position to take. And so just the idea, oh, I have the right to say what I want, so I'll just say and think whatever I want is an intellectually irresponsible position. And to tie it into politics, there's something of the notion that in a democracy, politics is supposed to be everyone's business. And so everyone should have something of an obligation to become informed about it, to be conformed about it, be informed rather about at least some of the issues, etc. So I also see people play funny games with this. So like the Vice President, Mike Pence, um, he was so harshly critical of these NFL football players who would take a knee, which is a nonviolent form of protest. And then when some right-wing people, I've forgotten now what it was, not wearing masks when they were supposed to wear a mask. I've forgotten exactly what it was. And he was asked about that. And he said, well, they have the constitutional right to do that. And so it's just an easy kind of inconsistency where sometimes you're focusing on the substance of what someone does and whether you agree with it or not. And other times you can just pivot to, do they have the constitutional right to do it? And people will do that. You criticize what someone's view is, and they'll say, hey, I have the right to say it. Well, yeah, no one was challenging that. Those are two distinct issues. So I think there is a lot of confusion about, what freedom means. So Deep, I certainly do agree with you about that. That's a very important point.
We have another question in the chat. This is can we realistically expect voters to punish political candidates for ducking questions? Of course, an individual's character matters, but shouldn't voters cast their ballots for the candidate that best match their policy preferences? This is from you.
Yeah. That's sort of a tricky thing about voting. You're voting for the whole package. And so what I'm talking about is just one element of it, not the only one. So right. I always think it's funny how politicians, when they win an election, they'll say, oh, well, this shows the public agrees with me on X or Y. No, it just shows they elected you taking into account whatever they took into account. You can't do this thing of deciding, oh, they're endorsing every single thing you're doing. So similarly, to punish politicians for pivoting, I guess really to be more accurate, I would just say we would have to see that as a negative factor in evaluating them, and maybe a more serious negative factor than tends to be the case now. But yeah, obviously I can't take the position that's the only thing that matters. So if there's a politician who pivots like that, but their policies are all ones you endorse, and there's somebody else who pivots a little less, but their policies are odious, I'd probably vote for the first one also. So I guess I should say should be one factor in how we evaluate politicians and maybe elevated higher than it is now. But yeah, you're right, not the only one.
There's another question thereafter. This is a little longer. With the increasing importance of social media, platforms are no longer a scarce resource. Platform owners have a vested interest to have people spend more and more time on their platform in order to have more ad revenues. There is no incentive to promote discourse with reliable evidence and logical argumentation. Do you think social media will further decrease the quality of public exchange?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I've been impressed by the high quality of questions and comments in this talk. I really appreciate that. I'm not an expert on that by any means. It seems to me social media is very much a mixed bag. A problem with Twitter is that it's hard to deal with evidence very much in a small number of characters. A problem with the internet in general is that people tend to be more rude on the internet than they would be face to face. So, with regard to civility. On the other hand, a really great thing about social media is that now everybody can have a platform if they want one, or at least almost everyone can. And so there are lots of really valuable voices that otherwise wouldn't be heard. And so as to the quality of public discourse, see, that's a complicated question because on the one hand, I think if you have good research skills, good critical thinking skills, then this explosion of media is probably beneficial to you because there's more information available, more different arguments available to you that you can evaluate. But on the other hand, in terms of what it does to the whole intellectual ecology, that might be a very bad thing because lots of crazy ideas go out there that seem to get a lot of credibility. They're near where I live in Munster, and just a few blocks from where I live a couple of weeks ago, there was a QAnon demonstration, a whole bunch of people demonstrating, that Tom Hanks and Hillary Clinton are part of a child sex ring, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got that kind of stuff going on. So I think it's very much a mixed bag. But again, I'm not an expert on that at all. That's just my amateurish take on it.
We have another question. Is there a particular difference in context of free speech when comparing democracy versus a republic, which the US technically is?
There probably is, but I've never really thought about that. So this is Orlando. Could I ask you to elaborate on that if you're there, just so I have a better sense of what you have in mind with that?
Yeah, because I was taught when it came to talking about what the United States as a government is, that we're not a true democracy, that we're a republic, that that as a people we're required to people to represent different sects of a nation, correct?
Yeah.
So so in a democracy where, correct me if I'm wrong, that's a particular that's a particular kind of government where people have even more say versus a republic. It's more so like choosing representatives. I guess what I'm curious is, does that sort of particular difference in any way affect how people are going to what should I say, to perform their
Yeah, I think I see your point. So if we had a direct democracy where everybody was participating in political decisions, then that would maybe make these ethical obligations that I'm championing, even more important. as it is now, we elect representatives who make these decisions for us. Although I'll say a couple of things, a couple of things about this. One is there was an interesting study done a few years ago. I remember one of the authors' name was Gillens. I've forgotten the other's author's name. I think it was Martin Gillens. So you could look this up if you're interested. Where they did a study where they argued that they were trying to figure out how much effect citizens have on governmental policy in the United States, where they were looking at it in terms of income. And they came to a very radical conclusion. And my understanding is it has been disputed, but on the other hand, a lot of people think their research is solid. They came to the conclusion that people who are not among the wealthiest 20% have zero influence on government policy. So in other words, the 80% majority that is poorest, zero effect on government policy. So essentially any policy that the rich favor, that the 80% of the poorest don't favor, the rich are going to win. This is what they were arguing. Now, on the other hand, I take the view, this is not inconsistent with what I just said, with Gillen's research. But in my reading of history, significant historical change tends to be initiated from below rather than from above. So when popular sentiment becomes strong enough that it's just politically unsustainable to take a certain view, that's when that policy tends to change. So if that's true, or to the extent that it's true, then we're back to this business that we all have a strong obligation to try to be moving the needle in the correct direction on any particular issue. So yeah, that's another really good question. Oh, here, I see Yu Yang has cited it. Martin Gillen's Affluence and Influence, Economic Inequality and Political Power in America. Thank you so much for giving the reference. I appreciate that. Oh, I see Dave Nalbone has his hand up. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, David, picking up on what Depot was commenting on earlier, it seems to me there's a tendency for the perception of freedom to increasingly be free of responsibility. I'm free to do this, but frankly, I don't care about what the consequences are to other people. So I'm wondering if, thankfully you're a philosopher, you can enlighten me a little bit on kind of the tension between rights and responsibilities. Well,
yeah, that's a good point. Rights and responsibilities are not perfectly correlative, but oftentimes they are. So like, for example, infants, I think, really don't have any responsibilities, and yet I wouldn't deny that they have rights. So you can have rights without responsibilities. And there's a question in particular cases as to how the two relate. So for example, in an ethics course I'm teaching right now, we studied a famous article on abortion by the philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson. I realize it looked like I'm going far afield, but I'm going to come back to your question by using this example. And so she argues that having a right to life, that leaves it kind of an open question, or there's sort of a gap in figuring out what other people's responsibilities are. So for example, everybody in this discussion, I would say, has a right to life, but for me to honor and respect that right to life, all I have to do is not shoot you with a gun, stab you with a knife, put poison in your food, run over you with my car, etc. Whereas for a pregnant woman to honor and respect the right to life of a fetus, if we say that it has a right to life, she has to carry it around for 9 months, house it, feed it, and so on. Now that doesn't settle the abortion debate. It's just to show the ambiguities about the relationship between rights and responsibilities. But having gone through that long example, I'd say in the speech context, this is kind of what I was trying to argue for earlier. We have this right to freedom of speech, but there's a responsible way to exercise that right, which it seems to me would not be just shooting off one's mouth ignorantly, but trying to become informed. And as I was saying before, being sensitive to questions, counter arguments, objections that other people make. So that's where I think there is that relationship. And I suppose even more so to the extent that other people are going to be impacted by whatever the prevailing opinion is. So in other words, if you have views which, if accepted, would mean other people are going to be treated badly, you have even more of a moral obligation to make sure, or to do the best you can to see that those views are well grounded. Now, that's not a very adequate treatise on rights and responsibilities, but that's the best I can come up with off the top of my head. Other thoughts of any kind, questions or comments? So if not, Mary Beth, should we go ahead and conclude the event, do you think?
If there's no other questions, yes, I guess so.
All right, well,
So-
let me thank all of you for coming. I'm really very appreciative of the turnout. I'm very appreciative of the very high quality of the comments and questions that all of you had. I've tried to record this in my technological ineptitude. I think I was able to do it because you just press one button. And so if that's the case, this will eventually be posted on YouTube. And if you enjoyed this event, stay tuned. There will be other Philosophy Matters events. I don't know, Renee, are you still here? And if so, could you say something about your November event? Renee, are you there? Renee may not be there, so I'll just, oh yeah, go ahead. Can you tell us something about your November event?
Yes, we are in process, hoping to bring several estheticians who are currently working on issues on monuments, memorials, and cultural heritage together for a roundtable. And if I can't have them in person, we'll do something recorded and I will give commentary on it. The issue that we would be addressing is one that was written about by one of my colleagues recently, which is focusing on what we should do with public monuments that have caused a lot of controversy after they've been defaced in various ways, so that they're now expressive of the protest. There's already an original question about whether Confederate should be just taken down or moved to different locations. And this adds a new sort of set of considerations. We're wondering what you should do when they actually have become a monument of a different kind. And she's offered a really interesting suggestion that allows them to ruinate, but not in their current social place, so that it can reduce the tensions that create publicly. And so it's a discussion that we're having in our community about how you balance aesthetics, politics, and ethics, all surrounding many of the protests that were happening this summer, having to do with and or utilizing as platforms public monuments, memorials, and statues.
Thank you very much, Renee. That'll be coming up in November, so be on the lookout for announcements on that. Mary Beth will post it to social media.
Look to our social media, the Facebook page for this. Also, the video should be there too. But look to our social media for announcements.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting. Again, thanks very much for your attendance and your wonderful participation. Much appreciated. Take care, everyone.